Hello and welcome to Beyond the Noise, the podcast series from PRWeek UK. I'm PRWeek's Deputy Editor, Siobhan Holt. Ethics and lobbying are back in the spotlight following revelations about Peter Mandelson's closeness to the late sex offender Jeffrey Epstein in the Epstein files and his influence. Despite cutting ties with the former Labour politician and ambassador to the US, Global Counsel, the advisory firm co-founded by Mandelson, has come under scrutiny. Some clients have reportedly left the agency. We won't be giving a blow-by-blow account of the scandal, but suffice to say it has rocked Starmer's government, with at least 2 high-profile resignations at the time of recording, including Downing Street comms chief Tim Allan. It's far from the only lobbying row to make the headlines recently. Many say tighter lobbying regulations are the only answer. So here to discuss the issues are Jon Gerlis, Head of Public Relations and Policy at the industry association the CIPR, and Leon Cook, founder of Atticus Partners, who is an executive committee member on the PRCA's Public Affairs Board. Thanks to both of you for joining us.
Pleasure to be here.
Thank you for having us.
Okay, so I'm going to jump straight into my questions. My first one is, what has shocked you most about Mandelson's actions as revealed by the Epstein files? Jon, do you want to take this first?
Yeah, of course. I mean, even for the self-professed Prince of Darkness, I think the revelations have been incredibly shocking. And I think when it comes to the issue of standards in public life, I describe it as a bit of a jigsaw puzzle. There's lots of different pieces. They're all connected together. I think what's so revealing about what we've seen from the latest revelations is just how involved Peter Mandelson's relationship with Jeffrey Epstein was when it came to some of the issues that are discussed, whether that's things around lobbying, around political finance, around second jobs. And of course, as you've already explained, the issue of access when it comes to particular firms and people who have particular relationships or existing relationships with higher echelons of political parties. I think what it shows is just how widespread some of the allegations against him have been, sharing state secrets, awarding contracts. However, when it comes to what I think is most shocking and alarming is the fact that this is a high-profile case. It involves a high-profile individual and a very well-connected individual. But this is not a unique case. It may involve quite a lot of different moving parts, but these examples are things that we've seen in scandals before. And it really points to the fact that the existing lobbying regulations that we have just could not prevent any of this. So it's telling that Global Counsel are registered on ORCL, on the Office of the Registrar for Consultant Lobbyists, and they have clients listed that have been awarded contracts that have been named within the files. And yet that was not able to provide any guardrails to prevent any of what we've seen. So this should not become about one high-profile individual with questionable ethics. This really is about the system that is essentially designed to fail. It undermines public trust and it just doesn't meet the basic standards of accountability. So there's a lot to learn from this, but these are things that we've been saying for quite some time. Let's not make it about an individual case. Let's really try, if we want to prevent the scandals, let's try and actually build the frameworks around it to prevent those from happening in the first place.
Yeah. Leon, what do you think?
I would echo everything Jon has just said. But this is not a court, but this is the court of public opinion. And accordingly, there is a pattern of behaviour here and has done. I'm talking specifically about the individual, about what they said in the run-up to their appointment as the US ambassador and subsequently. I personally cannot find any plausible argument of why he was even considered for this position, given what we know about the vetting process, what was identified to the government and the Prime Minister at the time, and subsequently, for that matter. He should never have been in the offing. And in fact, we had a British ambassador that was very well respected in Washington and was doing a great job, and they even asked for her to stay on. But there we are. I think that to the broader point of what Jon has just said, if there is ever a reminder of, for those in public life, the proximity to controversial figures, even historically, this stuff can come back and will resurface years later and carries extraordinary reputational risk. There has been a revolving door between politics and the industry for as time immemorial. We're talking that every government of whatever stripe has had this issue. But if the Nolan principles are supposed to be standing up for something, notwithstanding this one particular issue, there are 3 competitors, firms, that I will not name them, that are featured in stories linked to some element of impropriety in the last couple of weeks. That's 3 too many. So this continues anon. And I think that reputational due diligence and transparency are supposed to be about the bedrock of our public life and should no longer be an optional thing. It should be a requisite. But we're probably going to get into the machinations of what that means going forward. But if there was a time for change, this government was elected on the back of that slogan. Let's do it in terms of institutional lobbying and where that applies to across the political divide.
And how concerned then are you about the damage this is doing to the reputation of public affairs and comms as a whole?
Do you want the professional answer or do you want the real one? So the professional answer is, of course, I'm very, very concerned that, of course, the impact this will have. But to my point, that this has happened many times over many, many years, and then will continue and on because clients, whether they be governments, charities, trade associations, corporates, need access. They need to understand what's happening. They need strategic thinking. It's why the industry continues to exist. But where there are blurred lines in between access and the idea of impropriety, that's problematic. It really is. And the industry has never been deeper. And therefore, it's actually harder, I would say, therefore, agencies or those within consultant lobbying to be able to demonstrate why they are above and beyond. But I mean, Jon and I represent two sides of the industry which are therefore, whether it be the CIPR or the PRCA, to say there is a higher standard. It's called the Public Affairs Code. And its applicability should be universal. It shouldn't just be for those 20% of the industry that is represented by. Clients increasingly want ethical and compliant representation, quite frankly. I mean, when I founded Atticus, very early on and quickly, I wanted to join the PRCA because I wanted to be able to say, we abide by the Public Affairs Code. That's super important because Orcal, it only captures literally representative lobbying to permanent secretaries and ministers. There are multiple ways of which you can get around declaring stuff, and everyone knows what they are. Hence why, at least within the PRCA, we've strengthened what the Public Affairs Code is and says, and I think that needs to continue. But there have been a high-profile controversies that have thus far defined an industry, and unless we do something universally together, they will continue to do so. I mean, one last point, I'm warbling on here slightly, but how many former parliamentarians continue to use a parliamentary pass? Or how many firms are continuing to use either former elected members or members of the House of Lords in an advisory capacity and badging it as strategic advice? Of course, they're talking to people in the tea rooms. It cannot continue. If clients want to choose firms that do that, then they know what comes with it. And that is kind of my advice, or where I would leave it.
And what specifically then are the PRCA and the CIPR calling for in regards to lobbying regulation reform, and why? You obviously mentioned it there.
The current framework for lobbying is way too narrow. It only represents 20% of the industry. There needs to be a level playing field for all, whether it be consultant lobbying, in-house, charity, individual. There needs to be a comprehensive register within the Public Affairs Code for the PRCA. We're looking to widen it, that it isn't just ministerial, permanent secretary, special advisors and other levels within the political organogram, because that's what people do. If you speak to a select committee chair, is that not lobbying? Are you not trying to shape the environment? It is way broader than what it currently is. I think there needs to be stronger enforcement powers. We believe there need to be clearer sanctions. There just needs to be more transparency, really, and a better alignment between what are parliamentary rules, in which the House is governed by, ministerial codes, and lobbying regulation. And this probably is a very good time, actually, for the two sides to come together and agree on something. But it will require government and the House to play ball and agree to do something in unison, in triumvirate, in my opinion. I don't know whether Jon agrees with that.
Jon, you've spoken out quite openly about this as an organisation. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, absolutely. And Leon's completely correct in his analysis. So we've launched, after years of complaining about the system and warning when it was going through Parliament 10 or so years ago, how much of a failure it was going to be and how little it was going to provide in terms of transparency and accountability. After spending a while on the sidelines shouting about this, we decided to launch a campaign, Lobbying for Good Lobby, in 2022. Not long after the David Cameron Greensill scandal emerged. Not long after that, we had the Owen Paterson scandal. There was the Scott Benson scandal. The scandals kept coming. The legislation, the Lobbying Act as we have it in Westminster, simply isn't able and doesn't provide the necessary safeguards to prevent these from happening. So in short, what we're looking for, what we have at the moment is a register of lobbyists. What we're calling for is a register of lobbying activity. So rather than looking at who is doing the lobbying based on their defined role and what it is who they're employed by, what we want is an understanding and really a culture shift that points to the fact that if you are engaged in trying to influence the policymaking process in this country, then there has to be a degree of accountability and transparency that comes with that. So if you are lobbying, whoever you are, as Leon says, whether you're a think tank, a trade union, a charity, you should be very proud of the fact that you're doing that. It's an incredibly important part of a healthy democratic society. We haven't sort of done the obligatory, lobbying is important in a democracy bit of a lobbying podcast, which is obviously the first thing we should have said, but I assume a PRWeek podcast on this nature, most people listening will obviously have that view. But we need a culture shift where people understand that if you're engaged in that, it's an absolutely vital part of a democracy. You don't get much lobbying in authoritarian regimes, so you should be proud of the fact you're doing that. And our members, we've polled them, and they're very clear that they want to be transparent and accountable for the work that they're doing. So we need a register that does capture all lobbying activity. At the moment, it's estimated the Oracle register captures somewhere up to 4% of lobbying activity. That's just not fit for purpose. And it's got to also, as well as who is doing the lobbying, it's got to be, as Leon says again, about who you are lobbying. So at the moment, as Leon says, permanent secretaries and ministers, it doesn't cover senior civil servants, it doesn't cover SPADs, it doesn't cover opposition parties at all. So it needs to be broadened. I think really, if we're going to widen this out, the why is there's a real existential threat to our democracy here and the industry. If we're talking about lobbying being a healthy part of a democracy, as I said, not a lot of lobbying goes on in authoritarian regimes. There was a lot of research around this all the way back to the 1960s that you can point to that concluded that a lack of trust in politics leads to a destabilization of democratic political systems. Essentially, you lead yourself to a populist regime. That doesn't serve any of us who are trying to engage in the political process, working for clients, working for civil society, working for organizations, any good if you have a political leadership that simply won't even open the door to you in the first place. So when we're calling for this, and we've got unanimous polling from the industry, the polling from the public is fairly clear, they demand change. But really, parliamentarians should be seeing this as a benefit for them as well, because this is really about making sure that relationship between business and government is open, that the information journey between the two is clear, and there's a clear and ethical approach to doing lobbying in a way that creates better policy, that maintains our political institution and builds trust in the public view of these matters as well.
How hopeful are you that this is going to be a breakthrough moment on lobbying reform after this scandal, or are you a bit sceptical since you've just mentioned there's been a few over the years?
They don't stop. The severity of them or the profile nature of them sometimes changes, but essentially we have had many, many years now of quite high profile lobbying scandals that I mentioned before. This should be a watershed moment. We have had a commitment from the government following the allegations that have been made and the revelations that have come out that they will look at the system around lobbying and some of the other concerns that we have, whether that's around Lords being employed by lobbying firms, or whether that's around things like political finance, which there's a bill going through Parliament at the moment looking at. So there are commitments. I sound slightly reticent because commitments have been made before, and what we tend to see is that scandals produce small and reactive changes to some of the things that we're talking about, but not wholesale changes that we really need. And I think what we've really got to now see is this as an opportunity to bring in the wholesale changes that we're calling for. Done some real hard look at this. It needs primary legislation. It's baked into the Act at the moment. We can't simply, tweak around the edges. We do need primary legislation to bring this about. So there's certain things that can change with statutory instruments, with secondary legislation, so SPADs can be brought into the regime fairly simply. You can broaden it out to senior civil servants. What you can't do is open it out to in-house lobbyists or anyone beyond consultant lobbyists. So it does require primary legislation to do that. There seems to be a unanimous view now from the industry, within Parliament, from the lobbying that we've done, and certainly from the public, that actually this is now a real doorstep issue. If you like, before it was something of an umbrella issue, and it's sort of influenced how people would think about politics. But the issue of standards now really is coming up. It brought down Boris Johnson's government by all, to all intents and purposes. It nearly brought down Keir Starmer this week. This is now something that the government's got to grasp.
Do you agree, Leon? Are you hopeful that this could cause change?
No, I'm not. I've been doing this, unfortunately, way too long, for about 25 years. In that time, we had Cash for Questions, we had Expense Gate, we had PPE Gate. I mean, Lord Mandelson has been sacked from government 3 times, and yet we thought it was a good idea to send him to Washington. I mean, this will continue and is my pessimistic view. I hope I'm wrong. I think that all of the changes that I and Jon has just very elegantly explained need to happen, quite frankly, because how can it be right that only 4% of the industry is captured in what already an incredibly narrow scope of what the definition of lobbying is? Here's an interesting fact. AI can probably tell us how many consultant lobbying companies will use the word lobbying on their website or in their communication, because it has a connotation now attached to it. They'll call it public affairs, government affairs, advocacy. Many people in this space, including myself, are politically active. When I knock on doors and I hear "you're all the same," it drives me bananas. And the reason people believe that is because they see all of this stuff. It's all over social media. It's all over the 6 and 10 o'clock news, because they think we are indeed all the same. We're all in it for ourselves. And that's a major problem. So you hope at the advent of every single one of these incidents that something will change and that reform will come. But as long as we keep stuffing chambers with people, as long as we allow and turn a blind eye to them taking second jobs, or you either choose this or you don't. But then, I mean, there's a wider discussion here. We could do this for a long time about the level of pay of those that choose to enter political life, because why else would you leave corporate life in a very demanding and or rewarding job? So these things all kind of blend in together. But it can't be the case that you work somewhere for 3 years and suddenly you get a gong. But what have you done? The merit system, the award system needs to be looked at as well, I would say as well. There has been incremental change, case in point being the Home Office introduced FIRS, which was the Foreign Influence Registration Scheme. I was involved in the beta testing of that, where I pointed out to them, by the way, if you work for Ukraine, it's probably not a good idea to identify all of the people that work on an account, because you'll be telling the Russians who they are. You might want to remove that, case in point. So there are incidents whereby they have to engage with us because we have a fundamental understanding of how the system works and what is moral hazard or otherwise, but it's got to go way further. Government of all stripes, I'll say it again, have been plagued by this, and if they don't do something differently, it will continue and on.
So to back up Leon's point around that sort of skepticism, I think what we're really calling for from both organisations is just a very low baseline of accountability and transparency here. We did a report that Gordon Brown referenced in an article he wrote earlier in the week called No Rules Britannia, which looked at how the Westminster regime compares to international counterparts. We are firmly rooted at the bottom of the league table when it comes to transparency. This is just the basic systems that exist almost in every other Western democracy, in terms of capturing people on a lobbying register, in terms of who is lobbied, in terms of some of the legislation that is actually captured that identifies lobbying that happened against that piece of legislation. We have none of that. We have got an incredibly poor system of transparency that currently has somewhere around 280 records on its register. You compare that to Scotland, which has, I think, 69 times that. You've got somewhere like Ireland, which has around 2,500 records. So you've already got a system that just by design is failing. So I certainly share the skepticism. I think what we're really calling for is at least that baseline, so that when those doors are knocked on, you can point to something that suggests, listen, we are trying to address this. This doesn't solve every problem straight away. And as I said in my earlier answer, it doesn't necessarily complete the jigsaw puzzle around the whole issue of standards in public life, but it does provide a baseline and a demonstration of a commitment that if there is that question mark over the relationship between business and government, there is something of a safety net to provide some ethical framework behind that.
And at the moment then, how would you characterise the market overall for lobbying and public affairs? Is the crisis good for business, as they say?
Nothing like a good crisis to have clients run and ask for advice, what do we do? But to a certain extent, volatility, yes, it does increase demand. It also increases scrutiny. And coming back to the broader point, if you're represented by an entity that isn't a member of either of these two representative bodies. Why do you think that is? So disclosure and transparency is a good thing. Why wouldn't you want to uphold yourself to a higher standard? I think that political turbulence, of which there is an incredible amount in this country, everywhere for that matter. I don't know whether anyone caught yesterday the sessions in Congress of Pam Bondi, the Attorney General, being interviewed. It was get the popcorn out, absolutely explosive, and what they will or will not disclose. I wonder what the one name was on that list that was redacted, by the way. Answers on a postcard. But if you think about what's happening here, for example, where we are in the political cycle, whether it be late 28 or early summer of 29, we'll have a general election. Obviously, Reform are polling at 30%. And people think, well, Nigel Farage might become the Prime Minister. That change, that volatility, that what do we do here, people are going to start thinking differently about reform, and therefore there'll be a level of introspection into their activities over and above what there is already now. Be interested to see what they find. Clients want to do things in a risk-averse way. They want to be strategic about how they engage, and they're asking very tough questions. It's not just like, oh, we need help. Here's a contract about your level of governance, your political exposure, who do you know, and moreover, who knows what about you? I'm kind of going around the houses here a little bit. So yes, volatility creates opportunity, but it also raises the stake. I mean, it isn't just about the black book. Sophisticated counsel is very much valued, and it's not just about access anymore. And again, I'm not going to name them. Look at the three firms that in the last couple of weeks have been identified in relation to various bits and bobs. Each and every one of those is about proximity to the centre of government, how they got it, and what they were asked to do. That's not very transparent.
Jon, what are your thoughts about that? How are you finding things at the CIPR?
Yeah, well, certainly members are telling us that they are absolutely, when it comes to uncertainty and volatility, which has now been probably the case in our global politics for best part of a decade, they are certainly in demand. Perhaps the nature of what they're doing is slightly different. Now, the overall nature of the job doesn't change, but they're certainly, I guess, anecdotally at least, being asked to provide a lot more, I guess, scenario setting rather than perhaps proactive campaigning. So there's a lot more reactive work that's probably going on at the moment, and a lot more work to try and understand scenarios. So as we say, there's going to be elections in May in the UK, of course in Wales as well, and global politics has never, been more quite so volatile as it is now. We're still finding our feet post-Brexit. We're still trying to understand how you work out what's going on across the pond, as Leon's alluded to. So there's a lot more of organizations just trying to make sense of the world and trying to use public affairs services to help them do that. I'd say that probably what's really changed in the last 10 years, since 2016, has been the fact that governments have become a lot more used to campaigning on a reactive basis. And I think that does create opportunity, but it certainly creates a real, I think, need for businesses to try and understand how they can engage in that process. When if you just think about what happens across the pond, a few months ago, you just wake up and suddenly, if you're working in the pharmaceutical industry and Donald Trump overnight has talked about paracetamol being a cause of whatever ills he discussed, or on another day where he suddenly talked about putting tariffs on the film industry. These are industries that suddenly, one day to the next, quite literally have had to change tact and change approach very quickly. Now, that's happening here to a far less extent, but it's certainly the waves that come across the pond certainly being felt over here as well. So I think it's certainly an opportunity, but a slightly different nature of the work than we've seen perhaps over the last few decades.
Leon, do you agree? I mean, has the nature of lobbying changed at all under the Starmer government as it's progressed?
Isn't that what they were going to bring in and fundamentally clean everything up? How's that going? No, I think at the beginning of every 5-year parliamentary cycle, at least in the UK, it's about the proximity to those that are going to become the centre of government and or the policy making process, and how you can get your client and your cause in front of them and make them think that it's a very good thing because it will add to their legacy and that will allow them to stay on the government payroll as long as humanly possible. But if you look at the lurch from one crisis to another at the moment within the government, there's been a bit of a shift now from this personality-driven politics, I think, to what we will see to be a slightly more structured, policy-led one, because civil servants will have to kick in, because we may or not have another reshuffle. We may or may not have another Prime Minister in the second half of this year. Interestingly, one of the three firms that have also been linked to a story this week was one that, like many, oh, well, they're Labour. They're a Labour shop. They'll be able to help us because we're going to have 5 years of a Labour government. I think, if anything, has been proved through this last month or couple, it's actually about understanding how government works. The sausage is made across all elements of the strata of government. That's super important, having breadth in your network. You can map power structures, you can have I know so and so, but at the end of the day, it's always about good ideas. That's also super important. And if you only go for the option which you think is going to get you to that person fast enough, government, after I dropped my kids off this morning, I was thinking about this. Government, whether it be at federal level or local, is incredibly slow in its decision making. The idea that one person is going to be able to tick a box and make it happen for you, it just doesn't work. Certainly not in this country. We do not live in a Trumpian area as far as the UK thinks on how it does policy just yet. And therefore, it is about how you structurally approach or present an argument. And I think that may be one thing that might change out of this. I might be proved wrong, but I think there has to be this being a U-turn moment for, if the government can change its mind so often, so quickly, you've got to have a secondary argument and a third one after that, actually. And that means that you do things in a slightly different way and place more emphasis on discipline and coordination of how you present your arguments rather than just to the right person who you think is in the right place at the right time.
I'll highlight some research that maybe gives the government a slight tick in this box, because we've been fairly harsh and I think rightly so. Spotlight on Corruption did a report called Levelling the Playing Field, which looked at the issue of access and how organisations of all types, so civil society, charities, organisations of that nature, as well as businesses, have got the ability to access. I think the report showed that in the first 3 or maybe 6 months of the Labour government, all departments, except for the Treasury, saw an improvement in engagement. So business and commercial stakeholders vastly outnumber the number of charities and consumer groups and stakeholders of that kind by I think it's sort of 25 to 1 or something, but it's quite alarming. So there's an issue of access there, but it has gone up, which suggests that they're listening to a wider group of voices, which is good. Our view is that if you want to make good policy, you need to listen to as many views as possible when it comes to that particular topic and subject. So, as I say, apart from the Treasury, all departments have seen a growth in terms of the types of organisations they're speaking to.
In the news this week, we've had Comms Chief Tim Allan depart, and the government seems to be struggling to keep hold of their head of comms. I'm interested then to find out what you both think on the government's comms overall then in the past couple of months.
I'm going to try and be kind. The government has tried or aimed for message discipline, but I think that the outcome has not been narrative control. Let me put it like that. They've tried to define a compelling, forward-looking story, a vision. What are they for? How we're going to get there? But it's certainly not aspirational or inspirational in my view. But then I think that equally, Tim Allan, what is he, the fourth comms director? I don't put that on them. It's about political leadership. It's about key personalities, the Prime Minister, the Chancellor, effectively running government, coming up with an idea of how we're going to get there. Comms should never be, it is not the answer to all ills. It is how you message and massage your stakeholder group. It shouldn't be the policy-making machine in itself. I'd probably give Tim Allan a bit of a pass on this. It can only get you so far. And I think the deeper question has to be really about the centre of the narrative they want to project here on out. Because without that, for Labour and or for the government, we've got a problem, really. And this isn't just about politicking. It's talking about the growth story. It's about jobs. It's about how we're going to ensure that we have prosperity in this country and the youth are employed and there's opportunities there. So I guess my synopsis would be, don't shoot the messenger, but shoot the message. The message has not been good enough from the government, and that is what they should probably focus on, is what I would say.
I think famously Starmer is alleged to have said there is no such thing as Starmerism. He refused on a strategic level to define himself and what he and his government would stand for. He wants it to be not seen as overly political. I think that has been a strategic failure. I think pre-election, we had some very strong words. And in fact, on the steps of Downing Street, when he first gave his victory speech and talked about addressing the issue of standards head on. He talked about really taking himself, drawing the line in the sand compared to the previous government in particular. And I think what really has happened is he's done things the wrong way round. If we are going to see some changes in the sort of standards landscape now, those needed to be done first of all. The issue of standards is something a bit like a polluted fog. It really just stops you from seeing anything positive or anything good that the government has tried to do. So Anas Sarwar and his analysis of why Starmer should step down this week, made that point. There has been some good things that the government has brought forward, has tried to do. They're not getting talked about. They're not recognised. And that's because the issue is, if we can look at something like Boris Johnson's eventual failure as being down to three Ps of Pincher, Partygate and Patterson, the first few months of Starmer's time in office was, dominated by the three S's, the sunglasses, suits, Swift tickets. You can't come into government and say that you're going to tackle the issue of standards and then do absolutely nothing about it and simply hope that because you're not the Conservatives, that the public will simply accept that as a respectable answer. So it needed to just bring this conversation full circle. It needed to be done first and foremost. It needed to lift that fog. It needed to really talk about how it was going to be that government of service, as he talked about. And that would have at least then set something of a strategy and set something of a narrative that we just haven't had. And all that we have had is, it's been really interesting, isn't it? Because I think when you look at what has brought down, certainly two of the last 3 or 4 prime ministers, Boris Johnson broke the law and tried to change rules when it came to lobbying to benefit his party, and eventually it brought him down. Liz Truss's economic competence was questioned. You could argue, and I think some of the political commentating around this has sort of circled around the fact that Starmer hasn't necessarily done anything to crash the economy, despite people being clearly unhappy about how the economic performance is going, and he hasn't broken the law. And yet his polling suggests that he's doing significantly worse than both of those previous prime ministers. So public expectation is high, and I'd say it's high because of the narrative pre-election. And as Leon says, it just hasn't met anything close to matching that post-election.
Can I just add one more comment to what Jon just said there? If you think about it in this context, other than David Cameron, which was under a coalition government, no prime minister has seen out a 5-year parliamentary term since Tony Blair, right? In 21 years. What does that tell you? So there are lots of people in our space that are politically active and stood in the general election. I did. And I stood on a platform or a hustings and I said, change is not a program for government, it's a slogan. My advice to the Prime Minister would be, you have a very, very short window between now and May and the local elections to do something. So let's take it back to what we're here to talk about, which is standards. It's about engagement. It's about advocacy. Do something. You could announce, it is within your gift. You can do something tomorrow, today, in fact. Why don't you? Because if you look at the Prime Minister's questions yesterday and the exchange that he had with Ed Davey, the leader of the Liberal Democrats, I thought it was absolutely extraordinary. He asked a very pertinent question about why a certain person had been appointed to the House of Lords, given other allegations related to child sex offences. His response to that question was not befitting of someone that is leading our country, in my view. Therefore, you've got to clean up your act. And I think the standard we uphold of those in public life and what we do has got to be higher. That's all I say.
And then I'm going to ask now quite a difficult question, I suppose, to answer, but I'll ask it anyway because that's me. What are your big predictions then for UK politics over the rest of the year?
It'll be defined largely by what happens in May. I think the fact that we didn't have any movement on Monday in terms of a minister resigning or any member of the party beyond Anas Sarwar and a few backbenchers talking about Starmer resigning probably suggests it's not the right time for someone to make their move. The May elections could possibly be that time, depending on whether the polls, as they suggest, are going to give Labour, the electorate are going to give Labour a hell of a kicking, which gives, as Leon says, Starmer a matter of months to be quite bullish. I've met Keir Starmer before he's Prime Minister, and he's actually quite impressive when he's in a meeting. He's got a very good grasp of policy, he's got a very good grasp of the detail, and he can be quite firm. He has got quite a good, strong personality, which you just don't see coming across when he's, for some reason, in the media or speaking in PMQs, for example. He's got to try and find that. I think, the party said on Monday when they had that meeting that he came out, was very bullish, about, not giving up, not losing a fight. And there were certain suggestions from MPs that that's the kind of summer that they want to see more of. I think all of us want the country to succeed, and I think we need stability to be able to deliver that. And so he's really got a bit of a last chance saloon. So I think what's going to happen the rest of the year is probably going to be defined over the next few weeks. This is a real opportunity. So if we don't grab it, I think then we're going to probably see a change of leadership at the very top, and that will lead to who knows what.
And Leon, your predictions?
I mean, crikey, who'd be a pollster who would predict? I think it's a massively important year. I think, starting with the professional stuff, I think there's going to be continued pressure on standards and ethical frameworks. And to a certain extent, I actually welcome that. I think that's what we're here to discuss. That needs to absolutely happen in a political context. Has got weeks, if not definitely months, if not on May 8th or 9th, there will be calls for his resignation. They may already well be, actually. I think that they're probably lining up already. I think equally on the other side, in terms of His Majesty's opposition, Kemi Badenoch is doing a good job. But if the Conservatives go into 2027 in exactly the same place, major ruptions and problems will occur, and or the level of defections that continue. I think it's a massively consequential set of elections vis-a-vis Scotland and what that means then for the constitutional debate. Cardiff, you could actually see a change in government there for the first time in as long as I've been involved, working, quite frankly. And there are two other things that are going to play out at the moment. Where are we on this seesaw of EU versus the United States? Because there is a real debate starting to bubble up in terms of ever closer alignment. Oh no, they're our largest trading partner over here. And of course, we've not talked about him very much, but the big orange one, the Donald, the Prime Minister, he loves to play on the world stage because it takes him away from the problems domestically. But God forbid any government that had to deal with what's coming out of 1600 Pennsylvania at the moment. You just do not know day by day, week by week, what is going to happen. And therefore that suppleness in terms of your strategy is going to play out in terms of our politics as well. So massively consequential. If we are where we are, come the end of the year, Nigel Farage will sit down to tuck into his Christmas dinner and be very, very happy as it stands.
Well, we'll have to wait and see. That's all we have time for on this week's episode. Thanks so much to Jon and Leon for coming on. And thank you for listening. And until next time, goodbye.